This is Connections. From class to career, join us as we explore the interconnection between life, learning, and work. We're your hosts, Mark Andrade and Michael Spencer, recording from Humber Polytechnic. We're standing in front of an art installation at Humber's North Campus titled Pride Feathers by two-spirited Ojibwe painter Patrick Hunter. Humber is committed to integrating Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing into their academic programs, course content, and co-curricular activities. Support for creatives is also an important priority for Humber Polytechnic.
Today's guest works for an artist management company and record label owned and managed entirely by Indigenous individuals.
Our guest is Matt Maw. Matt is the director and lead artist manager at Red Music Rising, where he champions Indigenous talent and brings over a decade of music industry experience to the global stage.
Matt talks about his journey through musicianship, college, and networking at indie shows early in his career, and how his do-it-yourself approach helped him develop the skills that have made him successful. Matt also shares and reflects on his personal, academic, and professional life over the years, and shares how his own life experiences and history has shaped him into the current version of himself. Let's have a listen.
The arts in general are often sort of career paths that parents, for example, gawk at because, of course, they want their kids to traditionally follow careers that are more financially stable or successful or traditional. Now, I know that isn't always the case. I'm sure there's a lot of, awesome parents out there who are supportive of careers in the arts and music. Mm-hmm. But typically, I think a career in music is one that comes with a lot of challenges, the starving artist label, for example. Mm-hmm. So, my question is, did you always know you wanted to work in music? Did you have other career aspirations?
Yeah. I think that I came to the realization that I wanted to work in music after a few, I don't want to say failed stabs at post-secondary, but let's just say experiments. I was, very privileged to have grown up in a family and in a household that really, had an emphasis on music education and arts education. So I studied music as a kid. I took piano lessons. And then, music was a really big part of my identity throughout my childhood and growing up. Right. In high school, I discovered that I actually enjoyed and had a knack for singing. Nice. So I really sort of leaned into the vocal music aspect of it all throughout my high school career. I was actually I was in like a competition jazz choir, competition chamber choir, and then simultaneously I was also sort of experimenting again with saxophone and woodwinds in band in high school. Like despite going to a public high school when I'm from Kitchener-Waterloo, we had an arts high school that I didn't end up going to. I really sort of made music my focal point at high school. And then from high school, along with my passion for music, I also had a passion for theater. And so I really, once I got out of high school, wanted to find a marriage of those two and sort of pursue that professionally, because up until that point, it was really, it was my thing. It was the thing that I was, most passionate about. And frankly, one of the only things I was actually really good at. Like, I wasn't academically an incredible student, but musically, it was, that was where I sort of lived. And so my first experiment with post-secondary education was actually at the Randolph Academy here in Toronto. And for those of your listeners who may not be familiar, i.e. most of them, the Randolph Academy is a weird little private performance arts academy in the West End of Toronto, at basically Bathurst and Bloor. And I thought that I was going for music and theater, with the differentiator being and. And then once I landed there, I realized I was going to school for musical theater. Which as a kid who again grew up in theater and music, and lots of places where the two met. I had a familiarity and an interest in musical theater, but it wasn't necessarily my passion.
Right.
All to say, I made it about I think a year and a half into the program before I realized that I had zero interest in actually performing for a living,
Right.
and auditioning for a living.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I, in retrospect, maybe it was a little bit of little fish, big pond when I got
Right.
to Toronto after having been, so comfortable in my role as a performer in high school, which I think happens to most people that go to post-secondary, full stop. But yeah, the idea of sort of like fighting for my life to put food on the table in a cattle call,
Right.
forever and ever, unless
Yeah.
I somehow struck it big and became a movie star, didn't
Right.
feel super appealing. And also, to your earlier point, Mark, wasn't super appealing to my parents either.
Right.
Yeah. So all to say, I moved back to Waterloo to sort of figure out what my next steps were. Took a brief stab at graphic design at a post-secondary level. Quickly realized that while I had an eye for design, I had a distinct lack of hand skills. I still can't draw a straight line to save my life. So that put an end to that, unfortunately. But it was a really valuable experience in learning exactly what I didn't want.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, you seems like you've gone through like the performance part and the design part is kind of something we talk to students about a lot, is like, sometimes it's not, figuring out what you want to do, but what you don't want to do. And in your case, you had to try it like a year and a half, even giving it a legitimate shot. And then even in the graphic design. So no, that's really great. Sorry, continue.
I was in Waterloo. I started managing a record store, rest in peace, Sunrise Records. While I was working at the record store, I was, DJing, and I use the term very loosely, but DJing with my friends at spots like the Jane Bond in Waterloo and the Starlight Room, rest in peace again.
Yeah, I know.
In Kitchener, Waterloo. I had no grand plans of actually turning what I was doing into a career. Mm-hmm. And then through a chance encounter with a fellow employee at Sunrise, I was just sort of going over all of the stuff that I did outside of managing this record store. She's like, I just came back from doing a post-secondary program in Toronto at this little school called the Harris Institute. And she had focused solely on on production and live sound, but they basically had two streams. There was one for production, and another for music industry business. She's like, it sounds like you're already doing most of this stuff. Like, you can actually go to school for all of the things that you want to do for fun. Did a little research, applied, and then I think it was 4 or 5 months later, I went for my entrance interview at Harris. And moved back to Toronto with a slew of friends, moved into a 4-bedroom house at Bathurst College, had a great time, went to school. It was the fastest year of my life. Celebrated top of my class, or graduated top of my class at Harris for the first time ever academically. And then I'm grateful to say that I've been working gainfully employed in the music industry ever since.
Amazing.
That's quite a kind of path you took, right? But I think for me anyways, it highlights kind of two things that we've talked to other people about, and I know Mark and I often talk with our students about. One is that there's kind of like learning in everything you do, right? And even when, I think it's hard to see this in the moment maybe, or maybe just I'm not as like introspective as other people, but like you were talking about how like you were doing a lot of this stuff just kind of for fun, right? But and that connection you had at Sunrise Records was able to point out to you that like this is all part of like the business of the music industry, right? And so you were actually learning things as you were kind of doing stuff, right? And it's funny because we often talk to students and ask them about like kind of their experiences, and they're typically kind of obviously a bit younger, right? And their experiences and what like what they're good at, and they often think of like their hobbies and the stuff that they love as like separate from kind of professional characteristics or attributes that would be useful. But in actuality, like the stuff that they do and the stuff that they love is useful, right?
Absolutely.
I think your story is a kind of testament to that, right? And I think the other thing it kind of brings up, which kind of leads us into our next question, is the kind of importance of what we call it in the college system, transferable skills, right? The things that you learn in one place, even though you might be learning something for a specific program, that skill is actually transferable to like other things that you might do in life, and what maybe skills or mindsets, content, whatever it might be that you learned kind of in your educational journey, maybe specifically at the Harris Institute or elsewhere, that kind of turned out to be maybe even surprisingly helpful for you in your career, that maybe at the time you weren't kind of necessarily aware of it being applicable or useful.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, the most useful skill that I employ on the daily now, as someone who works very closely with artists in a variety of different facets. Like the work that I do with the record label is different than the work that I do with artists, but I'm still working, working with management clients rather. I'm still working very intimately in a variety of different ways with artists. And so, it wasn't necessarily something that I learned initially in post-secondary at Randolph, but it's something that I really sort of honed in on, was just the ability to speak musician for all intents and purposes. Despite not being an artist, being able to speak in their terms and have them inherently understand without a translator, I think is immensely valuable in my day-to-day, because a lot of my peers that are managers and or do work for record labels, particularly the majors, right? You've got folks working in various departments at the majors who may not necessarily know how to speak to art to artists or music to musicians, right? So yeah, that's something that's I'm find very valuable, and sort of thankful that I have a real grasp on the nomenclature, and that there isn't like a disconnect between between languages, so to speak.
Right.
I think the other thing too that I learned, particularly in a music and a theater and a performance environment, was how to deal specifically, and not necessarily deal, but how to work collaboratively with creative personalities.
Yeah.
Just diplomacy. Again, I mean, I'm coming at my career, and I'm coming at my role as a manager and also a label guy, from the perspective of a music nerd first and foremost. Like that's where my heart is. That's why I'm in the business. It's passion, it's art. But simultaneously, half of my job at least is, it's an industry. It's the music business. It's being able to take art and artists and be able to market and commodify and generate revenue for both myself and the artist, right? At the core of it, what I do for a living is walk the tightrope of the and sort of walk the balance between art and commerce, right?
Yeah. I wonder if you could expand on that a bit, because I think that idea is really interesting. Because I think often people think that creativity and commerce are kind of, they can't, maybe don't necessarily go hand in hand, or that they're like opposed to each other, right? But obviously they're not. I think, being able to achieve both is important, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I've gotten okay at, particularly my management clients being able to, um, not even necessarily speak music, but speak artist to them to explain the commerce side of it without it feeling, particularly gauche. For instance, an artist brings me a finished record. It's mixed, it's mastered, it's their baby. They've poured the last year of their life into it. It is their creativity distilled. And more often than not, they have what I refer to affectionately as artist brain, which means as soon as that record is done, it has to live in the world the next day. Which I understand from a creative perspective, because you've toiled, your blood, sweat, tears, trauma, etc. are all consolidated in these 10 beautiful songs. However, my job as your manager or as your label is to ensure that I take this incredible piece of art and put it in front of as many eyes and ears as humanly possible, so that you can build a sustainable career, that you as an artist can generate as much revenue as humanly possible to, sustain your livelihood, to put food on the table. Yep. And at the end of the day, really, I see my job as a manager specifically as ensuring that you can continue to make art. Like if that's your goal, is to, continuously be an artist, then I need to do everything in my power to ensure that you are set up for success to continue to make art. And then that just sort of, propels itself. Yeah. That being said, when the record is done and you hand it over to me, I liken it to a relay race with my artists, right? Like, you have completed your leg of the relay and you have handed me this record, and I've been waiting for it, but I can't move until you put that thing in my hand. And then I have my leg to run until we get to the finish line, right. Which entails getting a publicist, getting a radio tracker. If I'm not putting it out, working with the label who is putting it out to establish that we have all of the marketing assets that we need, that we set up a photo shoot, that we film a music video or two, that we go around and speak to all of the DSPs, the Spotifys, the Apple Musics, the Amazons of the world, and make sure that they know that the record is coming. And ideally, we have an in-person meeting and we hang out and we listen to the music with them in person, and we create early champions within the industry for you. And all of that can take a year, just to make sure that all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and that I'm doing my duty to you by setting up this release as best as I humanly can.
In an online article with SOCAN, which is the Society of Composers, Authors, and Music Publishers of Canada, you mentioned how your cultural and personal life and professional life up until a certain point had been fairly separate. As communications teachers, we're often encouraging students to find their authentic voice in the world. And we've been doing that a lot more maybe with AI and trying to get people to bring their authentic self into the world. We want students to reflect on who they are, where they came from, think about how they can bring parts of themselves into their future careers, whatever it might be. So I guess my question is, what value did you find in starting to see connections between your cultural, your personal, and your professional life?
Without it actually being a conscious decision throughout the vast majority of my life, the first half of my life for all intents and purposes, my identity as an Indigenous person in Canada and what I was pursuing professionally, I had no inclination to really to sort of incorporate the two. I think it is worth noting that, you know, growing up, I was not connected to my culture. My mom, you know, she's still around. She's great. She's here, but she was a part of the 60s scoop. So we didn't actually even reconnect with her family until my early childhood. I was probably about 4 or 5. There was certainly cultural reconnection for me specifically with, you know, with my grandmother and with all of the aunts and uncles and cousins I discovered that I had that, you know, we had no idea that existed. By that time, though, a lot of my mother's family's cultural connection, though, had started to, I don't want to say disintegrate, but, you know, residential schools, 60 Scoop, and colonialism in general did a really, you know, they tried really hard to just sort of eliminate the culture altogether.
Yep.
So the fact that there was even a semblance of culture to begin with for their, you know, for me to connect with as, you know, as a young adult was sort of a miracle. But by that time, you know, my grandmother, you know, rest her soul, a wonderful woman, was a, you know, fairly devout Christian woman by the time that we reconnected. Right. And so there'd be opportunities for me. You know, I went to my first powwow when I was 6 or 7, and my grandmother dressed me up in regalia. And so there wasn't a denial of our identity, but the, you know, the real, you know, capital C cultural practices of it all wasn't there at the time. So basically, which just leads me to where I was when I, you know, started out in my career. I knew who I was. You know, I've got a status card to prove it. But the idea of bringing that cultural identity into what I was doing, just, you know, professionally, just wasn't there necessarily. I think partially because there was potentially a little bit of fear on my part, having not, you know, been sort of raised fully in community or on res to be able to, you know, sort of self-identify that way at that time. And sort of, you know, wave that flag, so to speak. And then secondarily, I think because it just wasn't like, it wasn't a part of the zeitgeist yet. Like, people weren't discussing reconciliation full stop. Like, it just wasn't a thing. You know, I can distinctly remember a turning point for myself. You know, I was at a field trip, and I can't remember which year. And you know, again, rest in peace. Not here anymore, but for your students, Field Trip was an annual music festival at Fort York in Toronto, sort of helmed by Arts and Crafts Productions. And it was, you know, I'd still maintain that it was one of the best music festivals that I've ever been to.
It was great.
Yeah. All to say, I can distinctly remember being a field trip, running around with my friends, having a great time. And you know, having a passing familiarity with A Tribe Called Red at the time, just, you know, by virtue of the fact that they were, you know, they were sort of burgeoning. Hallucination now. And it was the first time that I had seen them, though, and seeing them on a festival stage at Fort York, you know, incorporating powwow sounds into, you know, forward-thinking electronic dance music with, you know, a political message, but it wasn't like backpack rap hit you over the head political message. Like, it was cool, and it was punk rock, and it was loud, and people were dancing, and seeing a, like, overwhelmingly non-Indigenous crowd. And when I say that, it was a lot of well-to-do straight white dudes lose their shit. Excuse my language, but absolutely go nuts for this performance and for this music that was incorporating my culture. I had a really powerful moment where I was like, okay, this is a paradigm shift for me. People are paying attention. This is cool. And like I can do this. I can help this groundswell happen in some capacity. Like, I know that this is what I want to do in music that will also culturally and creatively fulfill me.
You're the director and lead artist manager at Red Music Rising, an indigenously owned and operated record label and artist management company. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about your work with Red Music Rising and the work that you're doing to support Indigenous artists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, before starting Red Music Rising and after that sort of paradigm shift moment, at Field Trip all those years ago, I've got the posters in the back to prove I was there, though.
Yeah. I was going to say, I thought,
yeah. No, and I'm actually behind my ring light here. There's a poster of Tanya Tigak having won the Polaris Music Prize. So I've got Indigenous music locked down in my office.
Amazing.
In June of 2020, the idea for Red Music Rising had been percolating for a few years by then already. Myself at the table, the folks at APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and then the folks at Coalition Music, which is another long-standing indie record label and management company here in Toronto, responsible for the careers of Our Lady Peace and Simple Plan and Finger 11. We had all connected and sort of dreamt up what Red Music Rising would become. It didn't have a name at that point, but we're just like, we want to make happen an Indigenous record label owned by Indigenous folks, operating at the same level that everybody else is. So yeah, in June of 2020, we launched Red Music Rising,
Nice.
Which I refer to as a holistic music company. So we are a full service artist management company. We have, I want to say 5.5, soon to be 6, full-time artist management clients across the country, all Indigenous. And we are also a full-service record label. We are
Amazing.
a boutique independent record label with international distribution via Warner ADA Canada. So ultimately what I wanted to do was obviously create something where I had the autonomy to be able to work with who I wanted to work with and proliferate the art that I believed in, while also not siloing myself and being able to proliferate as much as humanly possible, to amplify as powerfully as I could. And so therein lies the relationship with Warner ADA. They very graciously came to me after a few years of operations to say, hey, we love what you're doing. We would love to help. And so after a number of conversations with Kristen and myself, I was the president of Warner Music Canada. I joined that family. So I still have all of the autonomy that I need to create a culturally safe space for the folks that I'm working with.
Yep.
And essentially act as a filter between the artist and the biggest machine, to be able to tap into the publicity, the radio, the marketing, all of the things that come with the big machine of working with a major label, while still being able to have a one-on-one relationship with artists who, traditionally have not been treated very well by the mainstream music industry in Canada.
Right.
So yeah, to be in this really privileged position of being able to live in both worlds, speak both languages, and form a bridge between the two, and also act as a buffer between the two to ensure that, the best Indigenous artists in the country, in my opinion, are receiving the services of the best major record labels in the company, or in the country rather, without the artist having to go in and explain their lived experience as an Indigenous person, or to I like to say perform indigeneity to
Mm,
ensure that the audience, being the major label, understands that they're indigenous enough.
mm,
There's a lot of sort of like cultural nuance and weird practice that I just am able to eliminate by being the guy who can speak to, my own community one on one,
mm.
and again translate that for a non-indigenous industry.
Because I do think, when you're talking about, especially that last part about, performing and, performing indigeneity, especially in a kind of, we could say, you don't want to fall into the tokenization or commodification of the culture in a way
Mm-hmm.
that, especially since it is being covered more in the media, that you don't want media outlets or things to sort of cheapen what the art is and what the
Yeah.
culture is trying to say, and filter it through these major channels. And it's your role seems incredibly important. Major bands like the Tragically Hip, and Gord Downey bringing light to Indigenous perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
But the most important thing is to have Indigenous voices actually speak, to their truth as opposed to it being filtered.
I tell people that, I work in the music industry and I run a record label and an artist management company, and that it's wholly Indigenous owned and operated. And things are changing, like general perception is changing. But I think that when I say that, a lot of people's first inclination is to say, oh, well, Indigenous music sounds like this, or
Yeah.
this is what Indigenous music sounds like. It's powwow music, or it's folk,
Mm-hmm.
and it's nothing really outside of that. But my mantra now, when going through the sort of spiel with people, if I'm at a dinner party or whatever,
Yeah.
is that I'm working with artists who happen to be Indigenous versus Indigenous artists making Indigenous music.
Yeah.
Because, pardon my language, what the fuck does that even mean in the year 2025? And so I'm working with people, artists, who are making music who is, of course, is going to be influenced by their lived experience as Indigenous people. I do not require it to look a certain way or sound a certain way in order for it to be deemed Indigenous enough.
Right.
So to that end, that the artist that I was, we were discussing before we started recording, Mark, Sebastian Gaskin, he is from a northern Manitoba community, lived in Winnipeg for a long time, is now living in Toronto. We've been working together for a number of years. We've known each other for a long time. His goal in his career is to just be a pop star. He's Indigenous. His
Right.
lived experience influences his heart, as it should. But it's not world music. It's not, X, Y, or Z. To that end, we've got a record, and we got him, he moved to Toronto, and 3 months later he was signed to Universal Records, and we have a record coming out on the biggest record label in the country in a couple of weeks. And it's positioned him, obviously he's Indigenous, but he is an artist first who happens to be Indigenous.
Right.
He's making pop music that happens to be made by an Indigenous person. So that really sort of like crystallizes what I'm trying to achieve in the sort of lane that I'm in,
Yeah.
culturally, but also genre-wise.
Using emojis in professional communication, is it overrated or underrated?
Overrated, but I think it can be done once you have a level of rapport with someone professionally. I would advise against cold emailing with a whole bunch of emojis. There's a time and a place, but
Right.
yeah, you just have to be cognizant. But I think, yeah, overrated to call it.
Okay. You got to know your audience first.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I'm listening to music on vinyl.
Underrated. Yeah, but it's just because I'm a gigantic nerd, and I also I'm just part of being a gigantic nerd is that I have a propensity for tangible collections. Like I collect video games, I collect records.
You like to have it in your hand.
My husband collects
Artwork.
books. Like I like having a tangible object.
Having a social media presence for your career, overrated or underrated?
Oh, I'm of two minds. Is it an artist career or is it just career full stop? Okay. Artist career, mandatory, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Personal career, sort of overrated, but not. I think particularly, and we're recording this in early February of 2025. And I'm sure that everyone right now is aware of the state of the world and the U.S. in general, and all of the people that own all of the social media that we've called home for the last couple of years. I personally have divested myself of all social media save for LinkedIn, because I think that it is the last necessary evil.
Streaming platforms like Spotify.
Again, depends. I'm a Spotify guy. I literally, the moment that Spotify was available in Canada, I had it. Because at the time, obviously, the promise of all of it available on your phone anywhere, was incredible. And, the streaming platforms thus far have been remarkably supportive of our mission and our artists and our goals, and really sort of creating a platform for us in Canada. So I'm forever grateful for that. I can simultaneously wish that legislature is put in place to maybe have the gigantic entity that is Spotify pay us a little bit more.
Networking and connecting with people in your industry, overrated or underrated?
Underrated as it relates to the music industry. I think that networking is a bit of a dirty word, but in the industry that I'm in, it is literally all about connection, who you know, and how to sort of leverage your network, right?
Matt, thank you so much for all your perspectives today, your ideas, your stories. We really appreciate you joining us on Connections.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. This was a lot of fun. Thank you, guys.